everyone. Welcome to Take the Lead, Change the Game, a podcast for women leaders looking to deepen their knowledge and skills and find enjoyment in the process. We're powered by Software Leadership. Software Leadership is a cohort-based coaching experience designed to fuel courage and ignite impact among women professionals. I'm Mindy Galati, and I'm here with my co-host, Lindsay Goldford-Gray. We are the co-founders of Safra. Together, we bring together a blend of leadership coaching, strategy, and lived experience to help women navigate challenges, seize opportunities, and lead with confidence. Today, we're going to continue our discussion we started last week of psychological safety, and we're going to dive into the research of Amy Edmondson and a little bit on Timothy Clark, which we'll cover a little bit more in a subsequent episode. As we discuss this topic, we invite you to think about your experience personally in the workforce and in your workplace, but also to think about how you can improve the culture of your organization as a leader. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi. Welcome, everybody. Super excited to continue on this topic, not even just today, but going forward, because I think it's so critical to not only success and profitability of businesses, but also, for your workplace culture and the happiness of employees and team members. So Amy Edmondson is one of the sort of premier researchers on the topic of psychological safety, and she frequently illustrates how psychological safety interacts with performance standards using a 4-quadrant matrix. And those quadrants are the apathy zone, the comfort zone, the anxiety zone, and the learning zones. And you can think of this as like the 4 potential zones of psychological safety. And today we're going to dive into each one. So I'm going to start with the apathy zone. So apathy zone means you have low safety and low accountability. So people show up, they do the bare minimum, and they don't care. Mindy, what's an example or sort of like how have you seen this play out in workplaces that you've, either worked in, consulted with, or been a part of?
Yeah. And what I'll sort of start with is that I do a lot of culture assessments around different types of businesses, really to assess where a culture is at. And one of the biggest aspects of a culture assessment is to look at psychological safety. And so the apathy zone, some of the hallmarkers are where there's a lot of micromanaging and there's very little autonomy. So this feels like a very top-down heavy approach. This feels very hierarchical. It also feels like sort of an old school way of leadership, like a command and control. So this is where, you're going to do what I tell you, you're going to do it this way, and you better just come in here and get your job done. And what happens is when we over tell people what to do and we micromanage and we kind of control all processes and there's no creativity and nobody really gets a say, they're not going to really engage much in the organization. And so this is where apathy comes in, because it doesn't mean that they don't work. They come in and there's a lot of companies that are ran this way. And obviously some companies choose this route. And they still have productivity. They just don't have great productivity. This is where people come in and they just dial it in. And I see this where, when I'm looking at companies and I'm assessing them, it's like, do employees, are they watching that clock? For oh, it's 5 o'clock, I'm out of here, right? Yeah. Are they always looking on LinkedIn for another role? What does your retention look like? And so the apathy zone is really where people are sort of 1 foot out the door. They still show up, they still get their job done. Maybe you're kind of meeting your numbers, but it's not done with any sort of enthusiasm. How about you? Where have you seen this?
Yeah, as someone who's worked primarily in sort of like high impact organizations where there's a lot happening, especially in the immigration space, I see this sort of when you hit the burnout phase, because even leadership is kind of like, I don't have any more energy to give. And especially in situations where the success rate is not high, right? We're sort of banging our heads against a wall from a policy perspective or even from a legal perspective, and the law is changing every day. It's really easy to slip into this zone where it's I can't care, right? My body. And because everybody's hitting burnout, it's hard to have accountability, right? And nobody feels safe because they're like, I don't know what I'm going to wake up to this morning.
Yeah.
And something I thought would be easy and successful previously is not anymore. And that feels unsafe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about the comfort zone, Mindy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the comfort zone is high safety, low accountability. So this is maybe not as much, so little command and control, but it's more nice. It feels more friendly, feels more comfortable. But no one is challenged, meaning that nobody really gets pushed to do better or have opportunities to try new things.
Yeah.
And this is where, you can still be productive and get work quality, but it's not very high, right? It's just sort of stagnant. I see people leave jobs when they are, obviously in the apathy zone, but even in the comfort zone. And it's not, and you'll hear people say like, well, it wasn't a bad place to work, but I'm just looking for something more inspiring where I have more meaning and purpose in my work. And so, high on safety is great, but if no one's held accountable, or if, nobody gets challenged, like you can kind of show up and do the bare minimum, or you can come and be a high achiever and everyone's treated the same, like may feel okay, but ultimately those high performers are going to leave. And the interesting thing is there's a lot of the like employment engagement surveys out there have over the last probably 5 years asking more questions around, do you find meaning and purpose in your work? In the comfort zone, people will say no. They'll be like, oh, it's a fine place to work. No one's mean to me, but there's no meaning or purpose. And this is where you get, I would say, low quality innovation, creativity, and it's really not going to allow you to level up in your career, or it's not going to allow the company to level up in sort of what they're producing. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I see this a lot. I would say this is the like when you're outside of the learning zone, which we'll talk about, like this is the one I see organizations in most often because everybody wants to be nice, right? So it's like, and psychological safety often gets mistaken for the comfort zone, right? Like you belong, everything's super safe. Don't worry if you don't get that thing done, and I mean, I've even been involved in organizations where they're like, oh, I don't want to use the word accountability. And I'm like, what?
It's scary for them. And you're like, this isn't scary.
Yeah. And I think that presents really big, and actually, I think it's from it actually does become psychologically unsafe. But I think a lot of people mistake. I mean, Mindy, you and I were just in our cohort this morning and someone was talking about the difference between being kind and being nice. And this is actually kind of right along a similar vein where it's like, everybody's comfortable. Everybody feels some sense of like, they're not going to get kicked out of the group, right? Like some kind of inclusion, belonging, safety, but they're not being stimulated. They're not being challenged. And so, purpose, meaning, feeling like you're going somewhere and improving is going to lack.
Yeah. How would you coach someone who's sort of stuck in this zone? Let's say you're coaching an organization to get out of this zone. What would you do?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I see this play out most often is people are really, really hesitant to give constructive feedback. And so, that's one of the main ways in which this plays out. And one of the things I will say to people is like, this does not have to be like, you're doing wrong and you're, XYZ and like shape up or ship out. This can be like, hey, this is continuing. I've noticed this is a challenge for us or for you or however you want to frame. Like, let's talk about how I can better support you and like what we can do to make sure you can get from here to there or make sure you can get tasks done on time. It does not have to be this like super contentious, hostile, I'm telling you, it can certainly, and it should certainly start much more collaboratively.
Yeah.
So on the anxiety zone, so this is low safety, high accountability. So the team is expected to perform at a high level, but operates in an environment of fear. So people are afraid to admit when they need help and they're hiding mistakes and it's leading to burnout. How have you seen, what is an example or two that you've seen the anxiety zone, Mindy?
Yeah, I have like a really concrete example, but I want to link this to what you just said above on like accountability, because again, accountability isn't mean. Anxiety zone is where it is mean, where it's like, hey, you better get your, everything done perfectly, or I'm going to fire you, or I'm going to write you up, or I'm going to, and so then people do that, but they're terrified. And then again, this is where people leave and where you don't get the creativity. It's also, I think, a big risk for a company to exist in this zone because, and I'll give you an example. I worked with an engineering firm where some of the project managers were too afraid to admit that they were overrunning their budgets. And so because they knew they were going to get in trouble. And so instead of raising their hand and be like, hey, we've got an issue on this project, we're overrunning our budget, they just hid it. They just didn't say anything. And it got compounded and it became a massive cost overrun, like $1 million on a $2 million project. So that's so significant. And I mean, it was like very problematic, but the problem was this was the like, oh, high accountability, like you better meet your budgets. But there was no room to say, hey, time out. Like we're not going to, we need some help. And so you've got to be careful that high accountability has to be matched with the care and concern and the collaboration, or people are just scared and they will not come forward when mistakes are being made. They're going to hide those.
Yeah, definitely. I see this play out a lot with managers where they're like, oh, so-and-so's not doing XYZ. Should I put them on a PIP, which is a performance improvement plan? And it's like, whoa, back up. How have the expectations been communicated to them? How many conversations have you had? And I think that oftentimes managers or business owners or law firm owners will say, well, so-and-so's not, doing what they're supposed to. How do I punish them? And they don't obviously use those words, but like it's punitive from the jump. And that, is generally not you're going to get turnover. You're going to get resentment. And oftentimes there is something that is kind of on the manager or the organization where it's like expectations have not been communicated clearly, or there hasn't been, people have tried to be nice for too long and not given any feedback. And now it's kind of like bubbled up, but the person doesn't even know, that. And so that can play out that way. How would you recommend coaching a person or an organization in this position, in this zone?
Yeah. And I think it relates to kind of both of the examples we shared, which is that you can't go from 0 to 60. Like you can't go from like, do as I say, or I will fire you, right? Like you can set some good expectations, but you've got to have really good feedback along the way. And keep in mind that everyone's watching you as a leader all the time to predict what will happen to them. So if they see someone make a mistake and they get put on a PIP, they're going to be like, oh man, I should never reveal my mistakes, or I should probably never ask a question. So you are telling a story of how you're going to react to others every time you react to someone. So be very mindful of that. So I would say this is setting good expectations, giving good feedback, building out a more collaborative type environment. And then when you hold people accountable, have an actual process that's fair, that isn't just reactionary, and that people know about from the get-go.
I remember. I was just going to say, when I first, became a business owner and was managing a team, my husband, who's a professor of organizational behavior, said to me, like, there should be nothing in a performance review that's a surprise. Ever. Like those conversations, like they should be like, oh yeah, I know what I'm going to hear, in the performance review every time.
And unfortunately, I hear all the time that, oh, I was so shocked by what was in my
I would say more often than not, right? So something surprising is said.
So I think everyone needs to be more mindful of that. The last sort of zone, and this is where sort of the goal, this is where we want to put ourselves as leaders. This is where we want to work. And this is what we want our companies to function like, is the learning zone. So this is high safety, high accountability. So this is where you get high performance. And there's, I teach a lot of workshops on high performing teams. You have to be in this zone to be a high performing team. And so this is where people are held to high standards, not excuses. There is a lot of accountability, but they feel safe asking for help, reporting those failures, those breakdowns, those budget overruns, and they get to experiment. So they're not told just what to do and how to do it. They get to be creative and innovative. And where I'll share an example with you where I saw this working really well was at a IT services firm. And, they have it's a very demanding company, and everybody who works there is really like over 45, like in the like depth of their career. These are experts. These are, they really know their stuff, but man, like their accountability, they had very high standards. But what they did is they had a lot of team collaborative meetings that were basically meetings where people could be like, hey, things are failing and I need some help. So they called them hackathons, which if you're in the tech world, you understand what that means. But hackathons are basically like, hey, I'm having a hard time solving this problem. Can we all get together and you help me solve it? And so what that did is it gave a lot of space to ask questions, to report failures, to experiment, to say, I don't have the answers. What do you all think? Or this completely got messed up. How do we solve? And that created this like super high performance because nobody was scared. Nobody was scared to ask questions. But they made time for that. Like they made intentional time to solve problems and to allow people to raise those concerns. Where have you seen this, Lindsay? And maybe how would you coach somebody who's in this zone?
Yeah. So I recently did a series of workshops and some one-on-one coaching for a law firm. And I would say that the firm is performing at a pretty high level in terms of psychological safety. We did an insight session where I asked a series of questions and just understood, what the attorneys were facing in terms of, it was actually client communication challenges. And one of the things that I heard sort of across the board was that they felt really supported by management, and that, that management always had their back with clients. And I actually think this is a huge piece of psychological safety as well, is like that management is not throwing their employees under the bus to clients. Yes. That does not mean that there's not accountability, that like if something goes wrong, that there's not a discussion about it. But like, especially in the client world, like to clients, like we are one team. It is not any one person's fault, right? And so, I think that they said that so consistently signaled to me that they felt very safe, and that they were also all really cognizant of, it was an immigration firm. So like lots happening, lots changing, and there are ways to sort of make sure that they stayed accountable. And a big part of that in that world is like, am I up on all the changes that are happening? You know, they were really brainstorming about like some ways to do that better, because, an immigration attorney in today's could literally spend all day, every day, just like reading the news and like, trying to figure out what changes had happened and analyzing those changes. And I really, really appreciated that. And there were a couple of things that I gleaned from that were not, my job was to do communications workshops, but like that I raised to management that had surfaced, but were not directly related to my role. And management was just like, oh, that's really good feedback. I'm going to institute that. And I trust that they will. And to me, that also signals safety and accountability, because management was like, oh, I've heard that these are challenges that we as a leadership team could do better, and I'm going to institute them. And that instills trust, safety, and accountability on the part of leadership. So yeah.
And that's exactly what, people are watching you. So they're kind of watching what happens when someone is engaged with you as a company or a leader or a law firm. I love that. And kind of be thinking about, we'd love to hear from you all, but, think about what zone your organization is in. And next time we're going to talk about the stages of psychological safety, like how you actually move from one stage to another, with some of the research by Dr. Timothy Clark. So great seeing everyone today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back here in a couple weeks. We're going to be off next week. Yes. We have spring break, so everyone enjoy, and we'll see you back here in a couple weeks.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.